What if Leviathan wasn't a monster, but the first witness of the divine rebellion? Before sound, before light, even before the heavens were formed, there was the abyss, not hell, not chaos, but a silent womb, deep and still. There, at the edge of what God had yet to shape, something existed that should never have had a name. Leviathan, the serpent of nothingness, the eternal cycle folding upon itself. While the archangels sang praises at the dawn of creation, Leviathan watched, without form, without time, but with eyes that saw what even God chose to keep hidden. This is where the forbidden story begins. Long before Lucifer's fall, long before Eden, when the first bearer of light still walked within the rays of creation, something whispered from the depths of the abyss, and Lucifer heard it. Why do the sacred texts avoid speaking of the primordial abyss? What if evil didn't begin with the fall, but with a pact between light and darkness? The Book of Enoch speaks of beings imprisoned before time itself. In the oldest Jewish traditions, Leviathan was the guardian of the border between being and non-being, a creature so powerful that not even the archangels dared speak its name aloud. But forgotten fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls suggest another truth. Leviathan was not created by God. He came before, and it was in that unfathomable void, when the universe still breathed in darkness, that Lucifer descended alone, not out of pride, but in a search for something even the Most High dared not reveal, the origin of free will. There, in the heart of the abyss, Lucifer didn't find an enemy, but a reflection. And then he asked a question that would change the fate of all worlds. If I am the light, what are you? Leviathan answered, and Lucifer was never the same. What was spoken between them remains hidden, but what was born of that encounter changed the heavens forever. A pact was sealed, and the throne was never the same again. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments. What if the true beginning of the rebellion didn't happen in heaven, but in the silence between two forgotten gods? The meeting between Lucifer and Leviathan was never recorded in any canonical scripture. No scribe dared to transcribe the words whispered in the womb of nothingness. But the echoes survived, in faded legends, censored manuscripts, and in the visions of those who saw what they were never meant to see. Leviathan did not speak as angels do. He did not sing like the cherubim. He awakened a memory within Lucifer, a buried knowledge woven deep into the very fabric of existence. Creation was incomplete. After hearing Leviathan, Lucifer returned to the heavens. But something in him had changed. His light flickered differently. It wasn't rebellion, it was awareness. Lucifer didn't want to overthrow God. He wanted to understand why there was a before even the Creator himself, and why Leviathan, who should have been pure destruction, spoke of balance. What if Lucifer didn't fall out of pride, but out of doubt? What was God trying to hide, keeping the abyss away from the eyes of the archangels? A 4th century Ethiopian manuscript speaks of an entity who knew the name before the name. In some apocryphal versions of the Kabbalah, Leviathan was seen as a guardian of the secret of reverse creation, the power to undo what has been done. That was the power that caught Lucifer's attention, not to destroy, but to remake. While Michael and Gabriel praised divine perfection, Lucifer questioned, if all that exists is God's will, why must he hide a part of himself? The doubt planted in the silence of the abyss began to echo, first in Lucifer, then in others. Angels of fire began to gather in secret, not to wage war, but to seek answers that perhaps only Leviathan held. And so, without meaning to, Lucifer opened a door between heaven and the abyss. But what crossed through wasn't just knowledge. Something awoke down there, and it began to rise. If this stirred something in you, like this video and help spread the word. Not every rebellion begins with swords. Some begin with forbidden questions. While heaven remained bathed in glory, something moved in the shadows of the angelic host. It wasn't war, it was curiosity. Not all angels followed the eternal hymn blindly. Some, touched by the strange vibration Lucifer had carried back from the abyss, felt something they had never known before, restlessness. They gathered in silence, among constellations that hadn't yet been named. They called to one another only through the sound of doubt. The invisible council was born. Leviathan remained asleep, but his essence had already seeped into heaven, not as corruption, but as a question hanging in the air like static. What is God? Without what he chose to reject? Lucifer, the light-bearer, didn't spread hatred. He offered vision, and that was more dangerous than any army. Why does truth threaten more than lies? And what if true disobedience is daring to see what we were told to ignore? In Gnostic texts, there is the figure of Sophia, wisdom, who fell for seeking to create without God's permission. And there's a quiet parallel. Just as Sophia reached for something beyond, Lucifer now longed to look where the Creator had forbidden. One of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts speaks of a voice in the deep waters that offered light before there was light. Could that forgotten voice have been Leviathan? The invisible council grew. Among its names, Semyaza, Erekiel, Tamiel, angels who would one day be cast into shadow. But back then, they weren't traitors. They were seekers. They longed to understand the nature of existence and why darkness had been locked away so tightly. And then, on the edge between heaven and what was not heaven, something opened, not a portal, an eye, and that eye saw. What it saw was the forgotten memory of a time before glory. And what it saw didn't just awaken Leviathan, it awakened the fury of the throne itself. Subscribe! What comes next is even darker. What if Lucifer's fall wasn't a punishment, but God's desperate response? The harmony of heaven was only an illusion. Beneath the veil of eternal praise, the silence began to break. The throne knew, no doubt escapes the infinite, the vibrations of Leviathan, the echo of the invisible council, the doubt spreading like fire through the choirs. All of it reached the presence of God. But the response didn't come immediately. It wasn't punishment. It was an ultimatum. Lucifer was summoned before the Most High. But there was no wrath, no shouting, only a gaze, and a single question. How far are you willing to go? Lucifer said nothing, because he knew the answer couldn't be spoken aloud. Why would God ask if he already knew the answer? What if the Creator feared what he himself had locked away? In the darker corners of rabbinic tradition, there is mention of a moment outside of time in which God spoke to one of his creations, not to guide it, but to warn it. Some Gnostic writings suggest this creation was the rebellious Aeon, one who did not disobey, but simply knew too much. So it was with Lucifer. He now knew something that even the seraphim dared not imagine. God did not destroy Leviathan. He kept him alive because he needed him. Standing before the throne, Lucifer asked one final question. If light exists, it's because there is something that must be illuminated. So why then did you create the darkness? There was no reply, only silence. A silence heavier than the abyss itself. And then the room dimmed, not into darkness, but into absence. In that moment, Lucifer understood. The fall would not be a punishment. It would be the natural consequence of outgrowing the role written for him. And Leviathan was still down there, waiting. Share this with someone who needs to see what's been hidden. What if the world we know was built upon the ruins of a previous creation? After the silence came the void. Lucifer was not cast out. He left, willingly, but he didn't descend into hell. Not yet. He returned to the only place where truth was not punished, the abyss. Leviathan was waiting, not as a servant, not as a monster, but as a living memory of what existed before God ordered the cosmos. Lucifer carried a different spark. It was light, yes, but a wounded light, no longer the reflection of the throne, but an autonomous flame, dangerous, unpredictable. There in the depths a pact was sealed, not with words, but with presence. Lucifer and Leviathan, light and abyss, touched. And something ancient awoke. What if the universe was shaped to hide, not to reveal? Why do some scriptures speak of monsters that God never destroyed? In the book of Job, God describes Leviathan as a creature that cannot be tamed. He never says it was slain. In Sumerian texts that predate Genesis, there are records of an ocean serpent that devoured previous worlds. an eternal cycle of creation and destruction, violently interrupted. What if what we call creation is actually a prison, a cage meant to contain something that should never have been erased? After his contact with Leviathan, Lucifer began to see what angels were never meant to see: cracks in the fabric of creation, fragments of an earlier reality, forgotten cities, sealed gates, and worse. He noticed other angels were beginning to see them too. Some vanished, some went mad, and some chose to descend with him, not out of rebellion, but out of memory, as if something inside them whispered, "We've been here before." Creation was fraying at the edges, and the throne remained silent, but heaven trembled, not out of fear of Lucifer, but because it knew what was coming next. Leviathan was awake, and he was beginning to swim upward. Have you ever wondered about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. What if the waters of the oceans still hold echoes of a time God tried to forget? It was subtle at first, but the universe always reacts when balance is disturbed. The seas began to tremble, not from wind, but from memory. Storms rose where skies were clear. Abysses opened in calm waters. Birds fled from the east. The air grew too heavy to breathe. And at the center of it all, one phrase was heard by those still able to listen: Leviathan is moving. The pact made between Lucifer and Leviathan didn't require words. It was an ancient recognition, as if both had always known they would meet again. And then something even more terrifying began. The angels started to dream. Since when do celestial beings have nightmares? What if the dreams of angels are memories of a world before ours? In the Hebrew tradition of the Sefer Harazim, there is mention of angels of the deep waters who only respond when creation itself is in danger. And in certain interpretations of the Zohar, Leviathan is seen as the keeper of pre-Adamic secrets. Ethiopian apocryphal texts speak of sunken cities that hold the forgotten language, a tongue that when spoken unravels reality. Lucifer learned that language, and he taught it. Then the signs began to spread. Blood-red skies, beings vanishing before the eyes of archangels, stars blinking out of rhythm, and the dreaming angels began to write. On the walls of heaven, on stones that had never been marked, inscriptions began to appear. It was Leviathan's language, a language older than light, and each word was a silent threat to creation itself. Michael was the first to notice. He watched the heavens, but felt the sea calling his name. And in the mirror of the eternal waters, he saw something that should not exist. Lucifer, walking across the ocean, eyes closed. And behind him, the scales of the end. Like this, if even one part of it made you feel uncomfortable. What if God's true enemy was the silence of the one who dared to understand too much? Heaven could no longer pretend. The throne knew, the sea was speaking, and Leviathan was at the gates. But there was one last attempt, a fragile thread of reconciliation. Michael, the warrior of order, was sent not as a judge, but as a brother. Michael found Lucifer where the sea touched the sky. He did not speak of sin. He did not speak of the fall. He spoke of longing. "Come back," Michael said, and in his eyes, centuries of sorrow, because before anything else, he loved Lucifer. But Lucifer didn't answer with rage, nor with pride. He answered with truth. "If I return, what will happen to what I've seen?" What if heaven didn't reject Lucifer for rebellion, but for clarity? Why did Michael hesitate at the edge of the abyss, even as the armed hand of the throne? There's a fragment in the book of Jubilees that speaks of a moment before the war, when Michael and Lucifer debated the creation of worlds yet unseen. In suppressed Coptic writings, Michael is described as the defender of pure light, but also as the only one who wept when the separation was declared. There was no sword at that meeting, only choices. Michael offered one final path: renounce, erase the memory, return to the light. But Lucifer knew. To erase meant to lie, to deny the pact, to deny Leviathan, to deny the origin of doubt. And so he answered, "If the light is true, it should not fear the shadow." Michael left in silence, but when he returned, his wings were heavier because he knew what was coming. The choice had been made, and heaven was now preparing for what it never thought it would face. A truth with wings and an abyss with eyes. Subscribe. The truth doesn't end here. What if the fall wasn't a punishment, but a liberation orchestrated by the universe itself? There were no thunderclaps, no explosions. The first fall happened in silence, like a tear held back, like a crack in a mirror that thought itself whole. Angels began to vanish, one by one. No traces, no judgment. They simply fell. After his meeting with Michael, Lucifer didn't lead a rebellion. He remained still, but the truth he carried burned inside him. And soon the other angels began to feel it too. Not to think, not to choose, but to feel that something in the order was wrong. The eternal laws, once unquestionable, now sounded more like chains. And in the hush of their doubt, they began to hear the language of Leviathan. What if the angels didn't fall out of rebellion, but out of remembrance? Why does heaven fear those who dream? In the Essene tradition, there are accounts of wandering angels who left heaven, not out of defiance, but through inner vision. In the Apocalypse of Baruch, there is mention of a void between the thrones, a space from which whispers emerged before creation itself. These writings speak of a second light, not the one from the throne, but a light born from darkness, the light of those who saw and never returned. Heaven began to fracture, not like shattered glass, but like a collapsing idea. Then came the first physical signs. Celestial gates flickered, reality rippled like torn veils, and from the distance, watery voices began to echo through the skies. It was Leviathan, not rising in wrath, but emerging with purpose. A rupture appeared in the fabric of creation. It didn't show hell. It revealed something older than hell. And through that tear, Lucifer descended, not with screams, but with open eyes. Tag someone who would dare to watch this until the very end. What if hell wasn't Lucifer's punishment, but heaven's hidden reflection? The fall wasn't a plunge, it was a passage. Lucifer crossed the tear in creation and found no fire, no screams, no eternal flames. What he found were reflections, a place made of all that heaven had rejected, made of the remnants of what had been forgotten, formed from truths the throne tried to bury. What we call hell was not a prison, but a carefully constructed memory. Lucifer walked among ruins that felt strangely familiar. Shattered thrones, faceless angel statues, halls identical to heaven's, but drenched in silence. And at the center of it all, a still black lake. There, Leviathan was waiting. What if hell wasn't built to punish, but to hide? Why does the reflection of light provoke more fear than darkness itself? In the Gospel of Thomas, there is a forgotten line. What is above is like what is below, and when the two become one, the secret will be revealed. In some occult traditions, hell is not a place. It is a state of awareness, the recognition of what was violently separated. Lucifer didn't descend to rule over evil. He descended to remember. And through that remembrance, he began to mirror heaven. Slowly, everything he encountered there began to make sense. Each room was a recollection. Each fallen being carried traces of an earlier time. And Leviathan, now fully awake, circled the lake, like a silent guardian. But then, Lucifer looked into the black surface of the water, and he saw himself. But he also saw God, not as opposites, but as two sides of the same will. In that reflection, Lucifer understood the fall was never a condemnation. It was preparation, because hell is not the end. It is the mirror where the Creator hides from himself. If this disturbed you, that was the point. Leave a comment. What if Lucifer didn't challenge God, but simply completed what he began? Hell opened like a flower of shadows, and from the center of its silence, something emerged. Not a scream, not a curse, but a new light, a light without origin, without command, without need for worship, a light that was aware of itself. It was Lucifer, no longer an angel, no longer a fallen one, but a witness. On the dark surface of Leviathan's lake, the image of God shimmered, not in mockery, but as an inevitable reflection. Lucifer understood. The fall was the revelation. that heaven was not absolute, that there is something that comes before obedience, truth, and that truth had been hidden, not out of malice, but because the world wasn't ready yet. What if Lucifer's greatest sin was seeing all of God? What if light can only truly exist once it passes through the abyss? In Kabbalah, the concept of Tzimtzum speaks of a God who contracts himself to make room for the other. What if that divine withdrawal created Leviathan itself? In the Gnostic Gospels, there is a forgotten idea that awakening consciousness requires breaking from the original order. The abyss was never the enemy. It was the mirror of the Creator. And Leviathan, his memory. In the end, Lucifer never wanted the throne. He never craved praise. He never asked for worship. He only wanted creation to know the truth, that light and darkness are sisters, that hell is a mirror, that Leviathan is not destruction, but remembrance, and that when God created the light, he also needed the shadow. So now, the question is no longer about heaven or hell. It's about you. If truth lies in the space between the Creator and the fallen, between the abyss and the light, which side are you on? And what if all of this is real? Share your truth in the comments.